Please.
I'm very delighted to have this opportunity to introduce Dr. Fedorenko as a speaker for today's visiting scholar lecture. Dr. Fedorenko is a Frederick A. and Carol J. Middleton Career Development Associate Professor of Neuroscience in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences and in the McGovern Institute for Brain Research at MIT. Her work focuses on the fundamental aspects of the neural architecture of language and the association between language and other cognitive processes. She studies language processing both in adults and in children, covering the range from neurotypical speakers to those with various developmental and acquired brain disorders. And her research includes a versatile toolbox of methods, including Fmri, intracranial recordings and stimulation, EEG, MEG, and computational modeling. Dr. Fedorenko is perhaps the best known for developing an innovative approach to studying language processing in the brain, where language regions are identified functionally on an individual basis rather than at the group level with neuroanatomical grounding. Today, we will have the pleasure to hear about some of the discoveries that this approach has led to. Dr. Fedorenko, I wish to take no more precious minutes away from your talk, but I do want to extend you a big thank you for accepting our invitation to speak at today's lecture, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you so
The
much.
stage is all yours.
Thanks, Maria-Lisa. That's very nice to be speaking to you guys. Of course, I've been following Moss's faculty's work for many years since I was an undergrad in Alfonso Caramatza's group back in the late 90s. So this is a version of kind of a summary of my work that I've been giving for the last, I guess, half a year to a year now. And it kind of pulls everything together through a particular lens of a question of why we have a system like language. So, let's see if that works. Yep. So I'll start with a quote by one of my favorite scientists, David Marr, who is most known, of course, for his Marr's levels of analysis. And I think one of the important things he's always emphasized is the following. So he wrote that to understand the relationship between behavior and brain, one has to begin by defining the function or the computational goal of a complete behavior. And only then can a neuroscientist determine how the brain achieves that goal. So this statement is kind of against these reductionist approaches where some people argue kind of once you understand the cells and cellular properties, everything will just kind of fall into place. And he's saying, no, you really need to think about what the relevant behavior might be useful for. And so what is language useful for? For many things we have as humans, of course, it's very intuitive, right? We have eyes to see, we have our hands to grasp things, our lungs to breathe. But for language, as of course many of you know, it's been quite a heated debate for centuries really at this point. And of course, there's kind of two main ideas that have been out there for a while. One is the more intuitive idea is that we have language to talk to each other, to share thoughts with other members of our species, and why that might be useful in terms of evolutionary pressures. There's again a host of ideas ranging from facilitating cooperative behaviors like hunting or defense to passing on knowledge either about kind of technical innovations or social information like who to trust and things like that. But there is this other idea that's also been around for a while, and that is that it's not at all about social exchange, it's about thinking more complex thoughts. And one of the most famous philosophers of language, Noam Chomsky, has been arguing for many years and to this day very vehemently against the communicative function of language and for this idea of language as a tool for complex thought. So here's one quote from his talk a couple years ago, where he said, almost all of your use of language is internal. Virtually all of the use of language has nothing to do with communication. The idea that language has evolved as a system of communication or designed for communication makes no sense. And instead, he's long argued that the system of thought systems of thought use linguistic expressions for reasoning, interpretation, organizing action, and other mental acts. And another famous quote is from Wittgenstein, who wrote, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." And, we can sit around and think about these things, but I'm a very strong empiricist at heart. And I always think it's kind of nice to have data. Now, of course, it's hard to have data about evolutionary questions, but I think it's useful to at least consider the kinds of evidence that might help us figure out which of these ideas may be on the right track. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about two kinds of evidence that I think may speak to why we have language. One, I think we can examine the relationship between language and other cognitive functions, including things like complex thought and reasoning abilities. And another is to examine properties of language per se to see if they may give us some hints as to what language may be optimized for. And because it's not a detective novel, I'm going to be arguing here against the idea that language has evolved as a vehicle for complex thought and for the idea of language as a communicative tool. So before I get into these different kinds of evidence, let me just get us all on the same page in terms of the system that I'm talking about when I talk about language processing mechanisms. And this is kind of a rough outline of where the system lands in most individuals. We've, of course, long known that there are some parts of the lateral frontal and lateral temporal cortex that are important for language. Using brain imaging tools like functional MRI, you can find this in just a handful of minutes of scanning, like literally 2 or 3 minutes will give you the system very robustly by contrasting responses to language processing compared to some stimulus that is perceptually similar, but is lacking the meaning and content. So you can have people listen to speech versus speech in an unfamiliar foreign language, or read sentences versus sequences of pseudo words like florp and blicket. And any of those contrasts give you these regions very robustly. Some properties of these regions that we and others have discovered over the years include robustness to modality. In both, so in comprehension, it doesn't matter whether you heard something or read something or saw somebody sign it. This is the system that deals with the linguistic signal past the initial perceptual processing. And so in that sense, the system is amodal. And similarly, in production, this is a system that generates utterances, and it doesn't matter whether you then eventually end up speaking it out loud or writing it or signing it if you're using a sign language. These regions appear to be similar across diverse languages. So we've been working on developing tools for probing the system in typologically different languages. Here's one figure from a recent paper. This is, I think, 45 languages. And I think this is important, not just because it would be nice to sample more languages. We want to make claims about the language system as opposed to about English, but also because I think some of the theorizing that has been prominent in language research may be in part affected by the properties of the language that has been most commonly studied, which is English. Like, for example, I think the emphasis on ordering of elements has been a little bit overly emphasized because English is actually quite unusual in its rigidity of word orders, and many languages have a lot more flexibility. And so we're trying to get the field to kind of move beyond the handful of Indo-European languages that have been historically studied predominantly, especially in cognitive neuroscience. These regions form a functionally integrated network. I'll elaborate on this in a second, but basically there's strong anatomical and functional connections among these different regions. And of course, the findings that have started our field, we know that at least in adulthood, these regions are causally important, such that you damage them and you end up with some deficits. This only happens in adulthood. You can take out the whole left hemisphere of a child and they'll develop a perfectly functional language system in their right hemisphere. But once the language knowledge is acquired, damage to the system leads to deficits. Another important point that I've been making for a while now is that the precise locations of these language regions vary across individuals, and hence this attempt to try to standardize the ways in which we define the system across studies and labs. So here's just a few sample individual activation maps. And broadly, it's similar. You get a big swath of activity in the lateral cortex, and you get kind of 3 blobby things in the lateral frontal surface. But where exactly they land is really quite variable. And oftentimes, if you use the traditional approach, where you put brains together in a common space and you assume correspondence at the voxel by voxel, at the voxel-wise level, you blur a lot of information out and often arrive at totally incorrect conclusions. And this is kind of the approach that has proven very successful in fields like vision research, for example, for many years. And but because localization may not always be possible, we're also trying to kind of develop a way to relate some findings from traditional group averaging approaches and these function localization approaches by creating this probabilistic language atlas. So we've now scanned over 800 individuals on these language localization paradigms, and so we can very reliably estimate the probability that any given location in a common space lands within this language network. And in this way, we can then interpret activation peaks from past studies, lesion locations, either in individuals or results of analysis like VLSM or VBM or something like that. So the hope is that this will kind of become a common reference ground for people working on language, so we can be more confident that we're talking about the same bits of the brain when we're talking about different parts of the system. Okay, so now onto this first kind of evidence that I think is relevant to the relationship between, well, to the goal of language based on the relationship between language and other things that we do as humans. We have a lot of different capacities. Perceptual, motor, and cognitive. A lot of them are shared with non-human primate and even non-primate species. So just to kind of review a quick survey of things that we do in the world, right? We have perceptual intelligence. We can do a lot of complex things with our effectors. We can do some things that other animals can't. We can do complex math, solve logic problems. We can even learn completely evolutionary new skills like talking to computers, writing programs that machines can understand. We can create and appreciate music. We have a host of executive abilities like attention, working memory, inhibitory control. We can plan and make decisions. Using a host of these abilities, we can solve totally new problems and stimuli we've never seen before. We're very socially sophisticated, right? We can establish very complex relationships with other individuals, build friendships, work together, as well as establish norms kind of at the societal level. And of course, we know a lot about the world. We know about objects, events that tend to happen, about the physical properties, physical constraints in the world, and about kind of the boundaries of real things or things that we can only imagine. And here is a few of the main individuals that I've worked with on trying to understand the relationship between language and other abilities. So over the years, there have been many, many arguments about language sharing machinery with all sorts of cognitive abilities. In fact, like as of 10 years or so ago, I could name kind of any non-linguistic capacity, and there will be some paper somewhere that would argue that language shares machinery with that capacity. I think it's now changing, but what I'm going to argue for here is that the language system does not support any non-linguistic abilities, and is in fact highly selective for processing linguistic input. So to probe the relationship between any two cognitive abilities, we have two primary methods in the field. One is functional MRI. This is actually the question for which MRI is actually very, very useful. For many questions, fMRI is not a good tool, even though it's used for all sorts of questions. But for this question, like whether two cognitive abilities share the same underlying bits of cortex, it's a very good tool. And then, of course, we have patient investigations where we can look at whether losing some linguistic capacity also comes along with losing some non-linguistic functions. So this is summarizing first data from a host of fMRI experiments that we've carried out over the last, I don't know, 10 years or so. And I've tried to group these different conditions by kind of the function that they tap. The approach in all of these experiments is exactly the same. So we use these functional localization tools I described, where you give people a few minutes of, for example, listening to speech versus foreign speech or speech played backwards. You find language regions in each individual brain, and then you say, okay, do these regions that work really hard when you're processing linguistic input, are they also active when you're solving a math problem, or when you're watching somebody engage in an action of some kind, or listen to a piece of music and things like that. And so here's what the responses to language and this control condition, which in some cases it's reading non-words, in some cases it's backward speech, look like. This is here averaging the responses across the system. Oh, important. I should say I don't think I made it super clear. So when I'm showing these red regions on this kind of group level representation, this is just showing the rough places where language activity tends to fall in any given individual. It's just a small fraction of each of these red blobs. It's usually on the order of 10%. So it's not like these whole blobs are going to be specialized for language. Okay, and this is the responses to language and the control condition are estimated with runs cross validation. So it's totally independent. There's no statistical non-independence here. And in different colors, I'll show you responses to these different non-linguistic tasks. So in yellow, we have a whole bunch of visual conditions, including both social and non-social stimuli. In orange, we have auditory stimuli, including the lighter shades are different kinds of music stimuli. In red, we have hand and face motor control. In pink, numerical cognition, so adding numbers, performing some kind of other math problems. In pink, reading computer code. In blue, a bunch of executive function tasks, so solving a working memory problem or an inhibitory control task. In teal, we have categorization tasks, so deciding whether a picture of an object belongs to a class of animals or something like that, or perceptual categorization tasks as well. And then finally in green, we have a whole bunch of visual event comprehension conditions. So this is processing meaningful events in a non-linguistic format. So pictures of, people doing things to each other, or watching movies where there's different kinds of visual events encoded. And you can see that these regions that work really hard when you process sentences, this dark gray bar, they work about as hard when you're solving a working memory problem or a math task or listen to music as they do when you're looking at a blank screen, which is the 0 line here. That's your low level fixation. If we draw a line from the non-words condition, this or backward speech condition, our control, across this host of non-linguistic capacities, we find that the only conditions that elicit a response above that control condition are visual semantic events. This response is still much lower, at least twice lower than the response elicited by sentences. And as I'll tell you in a second, it seems that this response is not functionally critical, such that individuals with severe damage to this whole system can still reason about the world just fine. But what exactly the system is doing in nonverbal event processing, we and many others, of course, are still trying to understand. It's important to know that all of these non-linguistic conditions elicit very robust responses in other parts of the brain. So it's not like they're bad tasks or anything like that. It just happens to be different parts than the ones that process language. Now, a complementary approach for looking at this question, as I mentioned, is looking at individuals with not a properly functioning language system. And here, most telling are cases of global aphasia, because if you have just a little bit of damage to that system and you find that these individuals can, say, do math, you can say, well, it's the remaining parts of their language system that are helping. But if the whole system is wiped out by, say, a major stroke, and these individuals have lost, essentially all of their ability to convert between thought representations and linguistic forms, then you can make very strong inferences about which things the language system is or isn't important for. So these are sample patients with global aphasia. And as you see, I mean, you guys are probably all very familiar with all of these cases. And so these are very massive strokes, typically massive damage, typically due to a stroke to a middle cerebral artery, which just kind of wipes out this whole pericilian cortex. The person who has been studying this population most carefully and extensively is Rosemary Varley. And in the last bunch of years, she and I have collaborated on some of these studies as well. And like I said, the logic here is you ask, what can these patients still do in spite of these severe language problems? And strikingly, to me at the time, it's becoming less strikingly as you get used to particular empirical findings, but strikingly at the time when I first was starting to learn about this work, these patients, in spite of their severe language problems, have pretty much every other ability intact. They can reason about the world, they can infer all sorts of social information from non-linguistic visual and auditory cues. They can process music, they have intact working memory, and so on and so forth. So the only thing that they seem to lack is the ability to convert their thoughts into a verbal format. And of course, to extract meaningful information from others' linguistic productions. But their construal of the world is just the same as yours and mine. And of course, these findings of preserved non-linguistic perception cognition absent the language system align well with the kind of selectivity that we've been seeing in the language system's responses. This is, of course, in line with all sorts of reports made by individuals with aphasia for many years. And there's a bunch of beautiful quotes about these intuitions about how nothing has changed about how they think about the world, what they can extract from the world. They just can't communicate about it. This is just one quote from a German philosopher who suffered a stroke. This is, I saw and recognize everything around me in its true shape. I tried to speak, nothing, couldn't do that. I therefore contented myself with the expectation that I would not be able to speak or write for the duration of my life, but that the principles and dispositions known by me would always remain the same. And there's, I have quite a collection of quotes like that from just introspective accounts. There's a few things important to keep in mind here. One is that functional specialization often gets conflated with innateness. There's no reason for that at all. Those are orthogonal dimensions. We know that specialization can and does develop by virtue of our experience in the world. The most prominent example is a region in your left visual cortex that specializes for processing letters in literate individuals, a region known as the visual word form area, which of course is not there until you learn to read. And the way that I think about the language system, which is in terms of the store of our linguistic knowledge representations, the mappings between linguistic forms and some aspects of the world, I think it doesn't even make sense to think about that system being innate, because of course we come into the world without knowing language, and then we gradually learn that there's this mapping between some strings of sounds or sequences of signs and some aspects of objects, properties, events, and so on. Another important thing is that functional specialization does not entail that the computations carried out by a particular system are different from some other systems. So we recently summarized this with a postdoc of mine, Corey Shane, in a Current Directions in Psych Science paper. But the idea is that, so we could have had a brain where we would store knowledge representations of different kinds in separate places, and then have some hubs that perform some generic computation, and these different systems would draw on those hubs, like, for example, performing some hierarchical structure building in maybe language and music and math would draw on this hub. But it turns out that it's just not how our brains are built, even though some people have argued for those kinds of views earlier on. I'll come back to this point towards the end of the talk, but basically it seems that although language is very likely supported by the very same kinds of computations that support processing in other domains, like retrieving representations from memory, or combining representations into more complex ones, or predicting how a representation is going to unfold, how the input is going to unfold. I think they're the very same ones that support processing in other domains, but it seems like those computations are implemented in specialized cortex, the very same one that stores our knowledge representations of that domain. And I'll revisit this in a handful of slides. And then the third thing to mention is this. So far I've been talking about adult brains, right? And I said, okay, you can have an adult individual, you can take away their language system by virtue of, say, a natural experiment, like a big stroke, and they seem fine with everything else. But could it be the case that to get to that stage, you need language, right? To develop some of these capacities, you need linguistic input. And of course, we can't do experiments depriving kids of language. That would not be a good thing to do. But there is some data that we can leverage to try to get some answers here. And this is data from deaf kids who are born to hearing parents, which is the majority of deaf kids. They're born to hearing parents. And so their parents will not have had a reason to learn sign language before they had a deaf kid. And in some such cases, kids in such families, they're loved and nurtured and exposed to all sorts of rich environments, but they don't get linguistic input for a while. They just don't get somebody signing to them early enough. And in some cases, that happens for a long time, like sometimes into their teenage years, they're not getting linguistic input. Now you can ask, do these kids, how do their cognitive capacities develop? Now, I think there's a lot of room for more careful and systematic investigations, but to the extent that people have looked at this population, it seems that with the sole exception of some aspects of theory of mind, kind of the most advanced social cognitive functions, everything else seems like you can acquire without linguistic input. You can learn math, you can learn reasoning, logic. Not that language wouldn't help you get there faster. Of course, it's incredibly helpful as a tool, as a teaching tool, right? You know, you teach kids all sorts of things, but it turns out that you can get a long way and pretty much, you know, to the same levels of abilities without access to linguistic representations. Okay, so to restate, the language system doesn't seem to share resources with any of the abilities tested thus far, which I think at this point is a pretty comprehensive set. But I'm not going to talk about this today for the sake of time, but there also appears to be a very deep connection between the system that supports language and the systems that support perceptual and cognitive social abilities. There is, again, the system is separate from the social systems. They are not sharing resources, but there's all sorts of strands of evidence suggesting that perhaps language and social cognition initially draw on the same resources and later maybe split up into language specialized and social specialized cortex. I think there's important developmental work to be done there. And I can, to those of you interested, feel free to follow up. I'll send you some references. There's basically a few literatures, including imaging of non-human primates that has been picking up speed in the last few years. Of course, there's a host of work on pragmatics and language. There's interesting work on the effects of social cognition, social skills on language learning. So there is basically, I think, a growing body of work suggesting that in spite of the separability of the language system from other things, there may be deep links between language and social processing. And we can come back to this in the discussion if it's of interest. So now I'm going to shift gears and look more deeply within the language system to see if some of the properties of linguistic representations and computations may give us some hints as to the function of language. And here's a bunch of folks who've worked on with me on these kinds of questions. So I'm going to argue to you that language has some properties that make it not well suited for supporting complex thought, as well as some properties that make it especially well suited for communication. So I'll start with the first one, and I'll mention two properties here. So what makes language not good for complex thought? If you think about like what complex thought is, it typically involves relating propositions to each other, to one another, right? It naturally involves kind of integrating information over relatively large scale. So we have to represent multiple things and try to understand how they relate to each other. Yet the language system appears to have a rather short so-called temporal receptive window. This notion has been in neuroscience for quite some time, but it's kind of making a big resurgence currently, and a lot of theorizing is happening around this idea of temporal receptive windows of cells or brain regions or brain networks. And basically, if you're not familiar with this, it's a temporal analog of spatial receptive field. So like most of you know, our visual cortex is organized so that the bits of cortex that process foveal input have very small spatial receptive fields. They only track very small amount of degrees of our visual field. And as you move to higher visual areas, they kind of pay attention to larger and larger chunks of space. So similarly, short receptive windows are cases where a cell or a brain region only pays attention to a very temporally local context, and it doesn't matter what happened, right before that. And other brain areas or cells or circuits have longer temporal receptive windows. And in fact, in both visual and auditory systems, it seems like the size of the temporal receptive window kind of scales with how primary the system is. So in the visual cortex, and this is work by Uri Hassan and colleagues, in the visual cortex, the earliest visual areas have very short temporal receptive windows. And as you move along, just like the spatial fields increase, so does the amount of the length of the preceding context that affects processing. We and a few other groups have now looked at the temporal receptive windows of the language system. And well, even before kind of Uri Hassan started developing these tools for characterizing temporal receptive windows using intersubject correlations, we've already long known that the language system doesn't care about structure at the discourse level. So this is, these findings are dating back to like early mid-90s. What I mean by that is that in very sharp contrast to structure at the phrase and sentence level, where the language regions respond, twice or 3 times more to a sentence compared to a sequence of unconnected words, these regions couldn't care less if you're processing a beautifully structured little paragraph where a sentence is kind of coherent to a narrative, as opposed to a set of totally unrelated sentences. So somehow it asymptotes at around the level of a sentence, and then you can more carefully do this in a fine-grained way to try to estimate the size of this context that matters for the processing of the current input. And it seems to be between 6 and 8 words. This is I didn't update the slide. Words is probably not the right unit. It's probably bits of information, because languages package information into words quite differently. And so this is just operationally, for experimental purposes, it's just easy to think of words as units, but across languages, it seems to be about 6 to 10 words. So that's pretty short. Why this particular span? There's interesting hypothesis about, from the span corresponding to what's known as prosodic units. So this is kind of how we chunk our speech output into continuous bits. We make pauses when we talk, and this turns out to be very closely corresponding to how people group their utterances. It may be to do with the fact that about this amount of bits is needed to describe an event level representation, like who is doing what to whom. And there's a few other ideas, but of course, at this point, it remains speculative. Oh, another idea, which I think actually has a lot of merit, is that about this amount of preceding input allows you to predict an upcoming word really well. And prior to that, of course, there are some influences from context further back, but about particular predictions of specific lexical elements, I think it's only this very short context that matters. Now, of course, our brains have mechanisms that integrate information over long scales. Here's a couple of systems that for a long time were conflated into one big blob, but methods like the ones I was talking about, where you do careful individual level analysis, what's now becoming known as precision fMRI. This is work from Rod Braga, by the way, showing that the system that people just coarsely referred to as the default network actually is at least 2 different systems with different functional properties and so on. But both one of them is the social cognition system, or theory of mind, TOM system. And both of these have relatively long integration windows. And I think these are likely downstream targets of the language system. So presumably the language system crunches through the input, forms some estimations of relatively, maybe event level meaning representation, then ships them down to these downstream systems, which then can construct a situation model if you're processing a story or something like that, or perform, downstream reasoning and so on. But critically, the language system itself keeps track of relatively short windows, and therefore I think it's just not a system where complex thought can take place. Now I want to argue specifically about another aspect of the Chomskyan perspective on language. So here's a figure from a review back, I guess, almost 10 years ago now, from Angela Federici, Bob Berwick, Chomsky, and Paul Huys, where I think this general division of labor here is okay. I mean, basically they say, okay, there's language, there's perception, motor control. So these are the lower level speech perception and output articulation areas, which are, that's fine. That is separate from language, totally all fine. There is thought, and they are kind of, in this visualization, they're acknowledging that it's separate from language. But then what they put in this language box is, you'll notice there's like stuff in bold font, which is stuff that historically was considered important in the Chomskyan tradition, which is structure, it's a linguistic structure. And then there's words, which, they think don't matter that much, which I would very strongly disagree with. But anyway, so as the kind of Chomskyan generative linguistic theorizing has evolved, this long emphasis on syntax has eventually kind of got reduced to a single operation, which they call merge. And the key claim about the relationship between language and thought is that the emergence of this operation in humans is what enabled greater complexity in this, whatever they call it, conceptual intentional interface, or effectively thought. Oh, and merge is, if you're not familiar with this framework, it's basically, you take two elements, A and B, and you combine them together, and now they form a more complex element, which consists of these two elements. So it's a basic combinatorial operation. Now, for this whole thing to work, for all of this to work, this operation has to have a very important property, and that is, it has to be abstract. It has to not care about what the elements to be combined are. Because if it's going to generalize from something like combining two words together into a phrase to something like combining bits of thought together into a complex representation, that combinatorial operation has to be relatively content independent. And that's in fact how syntax has long been construed in this tradition, as a highly abstract system, but it's just not. The abstractness of syntax in natural language has been questioned for many years, from work in linguistic theorizing, from traditions like head-driven phrase structure grammar by Ivan Sack, to construction grammar by Adele Goldberg and others, to much psycholinguistic and sentence processing work showing that people are exquisitely sensitive to collocations between particular words and the syntactic context in which they occur. So it's not just like you take a noun and a verb and you put them together and you're done. It's very particular nouns that combine with very particular words. So it's basically not these abstract part of speech kind of based rules that we store, it appears, but each word has a host of knowledge about how that particular word can enter into relationships with other elements. Based on what we've learned from neural data, it doesn't appear that there's anything like syntactic quote unquote hubs, a notion that has been very prominent in this idea of abstract syntax. So researchers like Angela Federici have been arguing that there is some bit of this language system that is just doing this abstract syntactic computation, but empirically the facts just don't bear these claims out. It seems, in fact, that instead that syntactic processing is carried out across that system as a whole. And even more importantly, it just doesn't seem like there is anything that cares about combinatorics in language, but doesn't care about word meanings. So any cell population, as we can probe with intracranial recordings, or voxel or brain area, where you find sensitivity to structure, and you can do that in a whole bunch of ways by looking at structured elements versus unstructured strings, or structurally more complex strings versus structurally easier ones, or strings that have violations of structure versus not. There's a whole bunch of tools that people have figured out to probe for sensitivity to structure. And critically, anything that cares about linguistic structure will also respond more to table than Blicket. Okay, I mean, this is an example, of course, but will care very deeply about meanings of particular words, which I think suggests that there is no clear spatial segregation between the parts of our language system that do combinatorics versus that store word meanings. One thing I should say that there may be some bits that just care about word meanings and don't care about syntax. There are some parts of the brain whose damage seems to just impair retrieval of sometimes particular classes of words. So that selectivity in the other direction may exist, but it doesn't seem like there's anything that cares about structure but not about words. All right, and I kind of basically already said that. Well, this is just to give you a little bit of the kinds of evidence that I have in mind when I talk about this lack of selectivity. So here's a very standard experimental paradigm that has been used to probe the sensitivity to word meanings versus structure. So you can have a sentence, just a random sentence from a corpus, right, where individual words are interpretable and they are composed into a sentence. You can replace each word with a similar word and they will be just a string of unconnected words. And as I mentioned to you already before, sentences elicit a much stronger response than word meanings, but you can also look at these so-called Jabberwocky sentences, which preserve like the core syntactic frame, so function words and functional morphology, but replace all real words with non-words. So you can very coarsely understand that it's somebody doing something maybe, or somebody having a particular property, but you can't really interpret it with respect to your world knowledge as you do normally in language. And then you can scramble this and you have neither neither word meanings nor structure. And when I started developing tools for localizing the language system, I was convinced that they will have some regions that just do syntax. I spent 5 years looking for these syntax regions. And in fact, this is kind of the design that I was thinking of adopting for language localization, because I thought, well, we'll use some subsets of these conditions to find word responsive regions and some subsets that will respond to syntax. And then, 5 years later, it became obvious that there's just no such separation that exists, right? So this is the distinction I was looking for. So maybe there's some regions that would be sensitive just to word meanings and not to unstructured stimuli, like lists of stimuli with real words versus not real words, so like Jabberwocky and non-word lists, versus structured conditions like sentences and Jabberwocky sentences, these uninterpretable things compared to lists of words or non-words. And instead, across the whole system, you find this profile with two main effects. So you have some sensitivity when you have either words or structure, and you have the strongest response when you have both. One way that I've come to think about it is basically we store a bunch of linguistic knowledge, we get some input, and we'll look for matches between the input and our stored representations, perhaps not unlike we store some visual templates for objects or faces, and when that stimulus is encountered in our environment, you detect a match and cells fire, and that's your neural activity. So here it seems like the more language-like the stimulus is, the stronger the response in the system. And this is true across the board. So this is just showing responses across two different experiments. We've now done this, 5 or more times, and it's just always two main effects. Sometimes you see slightly different patterns depending on some properties of the materials, but statistically it's just always two main effects. It's not because we're averaging across big chunks of voxels. You can do this on a single, you can look for individual voxels that show stable syntax selectivity. Doesn't exist, I assure you. You can look at intracranial recordings, and this is averaging across a bunch of electrodes, but there's no electrode that responds strongly to sentences and Jabberwocky sentences and not to, or less to, wordless and non-wordless. It's always this pattern of gradually stronger response as the input becomes more language-like. And the same is true for other paradigms. So like I said, you can look at violations, you can look at adaptation to repeated words or repeated structure. And again, across the language system, you find sensitivity to both. Okay, and this, I think a very important point that I think is kind of, this is the point that I said I would come back to, and I'm coming back to it. I think there is a very important shift, well, depending, some people come with that prior, and so maybe there's no shift for them, but I've perceived it as a shift in the field where there's basically more and more arguments made and more evidence reported. There's no clear separation between storage and computation in the brain. It's not like we have some parts of the brain that just passively store information, and then some other parts of the brain that do something with those representations. Here's a couple, if you're interested in just kind of general review of this work. There's a couple of nice text papers, one from Uri Hassan's group and one from Ishtadesh Gupta and Sam Gershman, arguing against this separation and arguing that memory is your kind of main computational resource. And arguments come from both kind of what we know from neurobiology, right? There's no cells that just store or just compute. That's just, no animal work has uncovered such storage or computation separate cells. And a big part of the argument also comes from what we've learned from computer science, right? So back in the 60s, people have figured out that reusing past computations is a very good thing to do. That's known as memoization, right? So you basically store function calls. You store a whole set of things that you do. If you do it often enough, it becomes efficient to store that whole set of operations. And then you can retrieve that, and that's your computations. And here it's worth noting that I think people way overstate how, I mean, language is obviously a very rich combinatorial system, but a lot of input that we encounter in our everyday life are strings that we've encountered before. I can certainly say, like, I can certainly say a sentence you've never heard before and you can understand it, but I think we should, if we take seriously the idea that our brains and minds adapt to the kind of input we get, I think it's very important to keep in mind that a lot of language is reused in chunks. And of course, there's quite a lot of theorizing and evidence for that as well. But I think sometimes still gets overlooked. Okay, so if language doesn't rely on an abstract combinatorial operation that can be applied to any kind of representations, combined with the fact that engaging in complex reasoning doesn't activate the system, it just kind of becomes unclear how language could have given rise to complex thought and reasoning in my mind. And in the remaining couple minutes, I just wanted to give you just a little bit of evidence for why I think language is actually very well suited for communication, information transfer. So there's now an abundance of evidence showing that our linguistic code, this is work across diverse languages, is on average short, which makes it easy to produce overtly. And it's also contextually disambiguated and largely redundant, which makes it easy to understand and highly robust to noise. This is a very useful framework that has been kind of revived and reapplied to natural language, and I think forgotten largely due to Chomsky theorizing as Shannon's communication theory, which is a very good general formal framework for thinking about information transfer. And there's a nice review of evidence for these properties of language a couple of years ago by Ted Gibson and his colleagues. And if language evolved as an internal tool for thought, it's just not clear why it would exhibit such characteristics. People who advocate that view will come back and say, well, maybe it didn't have these properties eventually, but then people start using it for communication, develop these properties, but then it just all becomes unfalsifiable. And, you can decide for yourself whether you want to argue with non-falsifiable stories. And another important bit here is that language processing turns out to be fundamentally predictive. There's now huge amounts of studies, behavioral and neural, showing evidence for people engaging in active prediction of oncoming input. In fact, as many of you know, there's now kind of a whole industry of people arguing that the whole brain is a big predictive engine, and it's doing it across domains and so on. And I want to give you one bit of recent evidence for language architecture being predictive, which comes from looking at computational models of language. So I'll just kind of breeze through it so you guys know all the stuff, right? There have been great technological advances just in the last bunch of years. And as a result, we now have these language models known as the transformer architectures is the kind of most successful class, like BERT or GPT-2, that appear to do really well on a lot of language tasks as measured by NLP kind of benchmarks. And of course, all of these models that have been so successful are trained on word prediction, next word prediction, or filling in the missing word or something like that. And in recent work, we and now a few other groups have tried to directly relate representations from these models to human neural representations as they process language. Again, the general approach is very kind of straightforward and transparent. So you have some data from people processing language. You take the same stimuli for which you have data, you feed them to the models, and you can obtain some set of unit weights as these models process a particular sentence. And then you can train a regression from the model representations to human neural representations to see if you can find kind of a good predictive model. And then you look at some unseen human data and see how well that model captures something about how humans represent those stimuli. And first of all, it turns out that this works remarkably well, which I did not think it would, but I'm always surprised in doing science, which I think is probably a good thing. But so we've looked at also, so another big thing about this particular approach is that we looked at a whole bunch of models, because of course we don't think that a transformer is like an equivalent of a language system. Most models are wrong. Some models are more useful than others. And we think that by looking across a whole bunch of different models and seeing that some classes of models maybe do better than others, we can make some useful inferences about the similarities between those better models and brain. And so this is the 43 models. Each bar is a model. And gray is kind of your normalized ceiling, like how well you can do. And basically on the right here are these successful GPT-2 style architectures, and they basically already hit the ceiling. But there's also a lot of variance in the models that I think we can explore usefully. But just to give you this key result for which I'm giving you all this forward here, very importantly, it turns out that the models that do best on this computational function of next word prediction, like how well they can predict next word relative to the truth of how the natural input actually unfolds, are the very same ones that do best on predicting human neural responses. So now each model here is a dot, and on the x-axis is how well they do on this next word prediction task, just as how well this model does on these NLP tasks. And then on the y-axis is how well they predict human neural data. And there's this very strong relationship that we see. And it's not the case that it's just that bigger models are better at doing next word prediction and fitting to the brain because they have more parameters, because you can take an unstructured embedding of the same dimensionality, so just as many kind of units and layers and whatever. And without structural priors, without a particular information flow through these units, you just don't do nearly as well as at predicting. So it's not just the size. And I'm gonna skip a little bit of stuff here. I'll just say that it's not that performance on any task has this relationship. So for example, how well a model is at judging whether a sentence is grammatical or not also varies across models, but has no relationship to predicting how well the model fits to the brain. This was a little bit fast, but we can come back to this if you guys want. But basically the bottom lines here is that I've tried to argue that the language system doesn't seem to support non-linguistic cognitive abilities, but is very strongly linked with a system that supports social cognition. I didn't talk about this evidence, but just kind of pointed to that link. And then it seems that some properties of language make it not well suited for complex thought, including the temporal receptive windows and the very lexicalized nature of syntactic operations. But other features like being well suited for prediction and and just like properties of linguistic systems, like their lexicons and grammars and sound systems having good properties for information transfer, suggests that it's maybe evolved for such a thing. And I have some speculations I could make, but I think I'm gonna stop here and leave minutes some time for question, and then we can revisit some of this. So thanks so much for listening. That's great.
Thank you, Dr. Fedorenko. It was an incredibly fascinating talk. We do have some time for questions.
I'll just put up my conclusions.
I see, John, that you have a hand up. Do you want to start?
Thanks. Terrific talk. Really enjoyed it. And I'm not very knowledgeable in this domain. So I'm strongly persuaded by the empirical data and strongly troubled by the fact that it doesn't agree with my intuitions. So, so I just want to ask what your thoughts are about the subjective experience of internal thought. And at least in my intuitions, it does feel like it's for complex problem solving, that I think in words more and more as I'm kind of laying out propositional arguments, thinking about, for example, scientific reasoning or thinking about social situations. So I did gravitate to why did this person treat me the way they did, and what does that relate to that happened yesterday? And it's just hard for me to think about how those would take place in my mind and why I'm using words for them.
It's a very good question, John. It's a very good question. People have, turns out, so I also have a strong intuition that I have an internal monologue running a lot of the time. Turns out that's not a universal. And some people don't know what you're talking about when you talk to them about an internal monologue. They say, oh, you're crazy, maybe you're psychotic, maybe you're hearing voices or something. So, and in fact, some people who do, for example, abstract math will say, if I start, like if words come to me, they prevent me from being able to think certain things. So I think in general, the nature of kind of the medium of thought is still a place where a lot of research is needed. And the reason that it hasn't happened is because it's really hard, right? Like, how do you tap into that? I want to say that I certainly don't intend to argue that language cannot help you structure things. And in fact, I think having developed a complex system like of communication like language, I think it likely led to more sophisticated social interactions, to things like, figuring out calculus and being able to send rockets into space. I think that's language certainly played a role there. How exactly it may shape thoughts, like what exactly does language afford you that you can't do without it, I think is not clear. I think a lot of us have intuitions where we feel like we understand something, and then we try to go and write a paper. We're like, wait a second, this doesn't quite all, follow, and writing things down, perhaps especially writing things down, but even like explaining something to someone else, right? You often notice that, wait, that doesn't quite logically connect. So there's certainly, it's not like language can't affect your thinking processes, but how exactly it does is not clear. And it certainly doesn't seem the case that you're using the same resources for thinking and for processing linguistic information.
Josh, Lyndon, I think I saw your hand go up next.
Great, thanks so much. Hi, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I guess I have a pretty big picture question. I'm sort of starting to, my background's in linguistics, and I'm starting to dive into the evolutionary literature space. And some of what I'm seeing, sort of, there's this, I guess, this pushback between the idea that questions like this have to be framed in this binary that just evolutionarily, something like feathers initially was for warmth, and then it was for flying. And if we find ourselves asking, is the feather for warmth or is it for flying, we're going to get really confused by penguins because it was for warmth first, right? So I guess, could you speak to sort of where you think we might be able to go next in terms of like zooming in and looking at maybe specific aspects of language? Because to me, sort of, it doesn't make as much sense to say language was for this. That sort of assumes that it happened all at once as this saltation. And I'm wondering what kind of thoughts you have on how we might specify that and how we might sort of set it up in a way that's just a little bit more specific and a little bit less reliant on that binary, if that makes sense. Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Josh. I mean, there's a bunch of things to say there. So I'm not a huge fan of philosophy, in part because I think it doesn't often allow you to get to the answers. You can think about it and it can be fun, but I really like to get to answers, and that's why I'm a very strong empiricist. So where I'm trying to push part of this program toward is trying to understand the relationship between language and social cognition and perception. I think there's a lot of merit to the notion that language arose from basic social cognitive capacities. Some of the evidence that I didn't talk about, for example, is that it turns out that, so we're very socially sophisticated. We have abilities to extract information from voices, from eye gaze, from facial expressions, from gestures and body language and things like that. And then of course also to imagine what other people think, right? We're very good mentalizers. It turns out that a lot of these social specialized capacities tile the lateral surface of the temporal lobe. They're distinct, different bits of those things track things like facial expressions and voice information, but it's kind of this mosaic of socially relevant regions. And then of course, a big chunk of it is dealing with linguistic input. And oftentimes in evolution, in brain evolution, where you have cases where regions are nearby, there may have been initially a proto-region that later splits into specialized sub areas or sub networks. Oh, it's a cute doggo. Where's a cat? No, it's a cat. And so, and of course, if development recapitulates these processes to some extent, you can look at awake infant scanning methods that Rebecca Sachs at MIT and a few other groups across the world have been pioneering and trying to advance. And the prediction then there is that in the infant brain, there will be a big swath of cortex that responds to social stimuli in general. That seems very plausible, right? We're social species, infants are completely useless. They will die if they're not paying attention to their caregivers and things like that. And so the idea is that you would have this kind of proto-social cortex early on. And as you get experience in the world, different parts of that system become specialized for tracking different aspects of the conspecific information, including eventually a big chunk of it that stores your mapping between forms and meanings. So my approach will be to try to push on this through the lens of development and try to see if we can actually find empirical support for the idea that language and social cortex may share machinery to some extent. We're also working with individuals with early brain damage. So for example, we've been tracking this family where there's two sisters. One of them was born without her left temporal lobe and one without her right temporal lobe. And given that language is generally left lateralized and social cognition is right lateralized, we're trying to see if there's some constraints on reorganization in cases where these functions are kind of forced to cohabit the same parts of the brain. So that's like another empirical lens. And like I said, there's non-human primate work where with increases in with the improvements in imaging of non-human primates, there's if you look at, there's now 2 reports, one in macaques, one in marmosets. And if you look at the parts of the brain that respond to conspecifics communicating, you find a system that's eerily resembling the language topography, the language networks topography in humans. And that's really intriguing. And now there's tools like RNA-seq where we can look at single cell properties. And some things we're doing is trying to look at postmortem brains, extract information from cells in the social cortex and the language cortex versus some control cortices, and see if there is any kind of story to be told there. So I think there's a lot of actual applied research to do to try to get closer to how this may have happened, with more precision and clarity. But that's where we are.
Even though we are technically over time, if you don't mind answering a few more questions, those who have time to stay could still ask.
Sure.
Joshua, you've been having a question for a while. Would you ask it, please?
Hello. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. My question is related to a couple of the questions that have been asked, but similar to Josh Linden, I was, it seems to me that the complex thought and the communication aren't on the face of it mutually exclusive. And I appreciate, the rather convincing data you brought against the complex thought hypothesis. But I'm wondering, given that at least in principle you might have some overlap among those views, what you think about any other possibilities. For example, you were talking about mathematicians not preferring not to use language for complex thought. So, for example, like one possibility could be that we might see individual differences in people who prefer using language to enable complex thought, whereas others don't. Do you think any of your data would support that view, or just curious what your thoughts are?
I mean, if it's stable, meaningful differences, then in principle, you should find people for whom the language system will be active when they're doing math, when they're listening to hierarchically complex structured music, or when they reason logically, right? To the best of my knowledge, that hasn't materialized. Like I'm not aware of any such reports. I mean, we look, we do everything at the individual level, right, before we average responses together. And it seems like it's there's definitely some variability, but everything clusters around 0. I mean, there's I would say there is very little evidence to suggest that people fundamentally think, well, fundamentally different their use of the language system. Now, there's definitely differences in how people think, for sure. People like Gary Lupien, I think, is probably one who has studied this most kind of systematically in recent days, but that's certainly true. But I would think that all of that thinking happens downstream of the language system when we interpret language, and upstream when we generate language. I just think it happens somewhere else. But of course, there's differences in how people think.
Laurel, it looks like you're next.
Thank you. Ev, thank you. It's great to finally meet you. I've been following your work for a while. Yeah. I actually wondered, and I'm along, I think I might share with Josh and whoever was whoever spoke before Josh, the idea that maybe we don't need to be quite so dichotomous, whether language has no role, whether language has a primary, critical, central role. And I actually noticed that you're mostly talking about structure and syntax and complex thought. And I do wonder about work that does suggest that, like Gary Lupien's work, that suggests that language has a really important role in organizing our semantic knowledge of the world. That we know that it organizes perception. We know that it organizes motion, even motion perception. And the question is, what role do those representations have in complex thought? So you have to be able to pull up nouns and entities and in order to think quickly and clearly. So do you really think that language doesn't even play a role in semantics? What is the role of iconicity, for example?
I do. I have a lot of respect for Gary's work. I do disagree with him quite fundamentally on many things.
Clearly.
But I'll also say that, so to clarify, when people talk about effects of language on perception or on cognition, I think a lot of the time they mean different things. So one thing that I think has been pretty consistent across various domains is that we are very utilitarian. If we can use language to help us do some task better, we'll use it. If our language encodes some distinction and the task requires to keep track of that distinction, we'll encode it linguistically and we'll use it. Whether the language fundamentally changes the underlying representations, perceptual or conceptual, I think is still quite debated. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. It's quite debated, although I think the relationship between language and our world knowledge, that's probably one of the biggest things to figure out still, because how our brains represent meanings, I think there is a lot of open questions still. And the views vary from, we have these hubs sitting in the front of the temporal lobes that store our abstract concepts, to it's totally distributed and is everywhere, to some combination of maybe there's some regions that do store different kinds of concepts and so on. And I think actually the computational language models that I talked about, they can be a very useful tool to separate formal linguistic competence from our knowledge of the world. It's actually, they're a beautiful cut potentially through the human mind, in that, and it's so interesting. These models are often criticized for not being able to reason about the world, but how could they reason about the world? They're just trained on corpora. So they learn linguistic statistics. They learn an impressive amount of linguistic statistics. They learn things that generative linguists, as of a few years ago, said a machine will never learn that based on statistical concurrences alone. They do. Mm-hmm. They learn long distance agreement. They learn all sorts of hierarchical representations. They learn a lot, but of course they can't learn about the world. How would they, right? They have no access to that information. And so I think treating that as a model of the language system, and then trying to leverage other models that exist that represent our visuals, that represent kind of general reasoning capacities, may be a fruitful general avenue to try to get something closer to mechanistic level understanding of these different things beyond kind of just verbal hypotheses about how they may relate to each other. But I think that, that's definitely one place where I think there's a lot more work to be done. But yeah, I like iconicity. I mean, I think there's definitely relationships between, like, I think there's a lot of aspects of the world that get reflected in linguistic properties for sure. And presumably that's because it makes it easier to learn, process, whatever. But how language may fundamentally change our representations of the world, I think we just don't know yet. And again, cross-species work will be very useful there as well.
Thanks.
Tiffany, would you like to go next?
Thank you. So first of all, thank you so much for that talk. It was so interesting. So I recently watched a lecture series by Gregory Hickok, and he was talking about some of his more recent work. And I think it kind of aligns well with what you were talking about in relation to syntax. So in a few of his studies, he found evidence that like the posterior middle frontal gyrus plays a role in prosodic planning. And prosodic structure correlates with like different syntactic features and has been proposed previously as like a planning frame for like the serial ordering of different lexical elements and their constituents during language production. So I'm wondering if rather than like having a specific like syntactic hub, so Gregory proposed that maybe it's this like prosodic planning hub, and that this is what might explain why we see things like expressive agrammaticism in certain clinical populations due to like impairment of this particular hub. What are your thoughts on that kind of proposal?
I think the empirical landscape is much more complex than sometimes people acknowledge. Like, for example, just relative to the latest thing you said, there are people with expressive agrammatism that vary widely. Some of them have quite preserved prosodic contours, some of them don't. I mean, so there's a dissociation that already kind of rules out that as a sole explanation of expressive agrammatism. In terms of whether there's something like a prosodic hub, I think there is not tremendously much that we know about neural mechanisms supporting prosody. If somebody finds a brain region that selectively supports prosodic planning, that would be an important discovery. I have a postdoc who works on prosody perception. We're trying to kind of using these individual methods, individual subject methods, to try to see if there's specialization for prosody at the perceptual level. If there is some such thing at the production level, that's great. I'm not aware of any evidence for such a thing, so I suspect it's kind of, like a speculative proposal. But sure, all things are possible. I mean, I've learned to be surprised over and over in my scientific career, so certainly I can't argue if there is no data, and I try to keep an open mind.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Are you willing to take a few more?
Sure, yeah. Go for it.
Okay, Erica, you're next.
Thanks. So I come from a spatial cognition background, so I just have to kind of throw something out there for spatial cognition. So I noticed in kind of the battery of abilities that you looked at, there wasn't necessarily a spatial cognition kind of component, but we know that language shapes the way that we think about space, especially given that some cultures don't even have a representation of right and left, at least linguistically. So I was just kind of curious to pick your brain about that.
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, so we've looked at things like spatial memory, but it's true, we haven't, in imaging work, we haven't looked at something like navigation. But I think the most like clearly articulated proposal is like Hermes and Spelke from whatever it is, 97 or something, where encoding certain bits linguistically can help you keep track of like landmarks. And Rosemary Varley has work on evaluating this, and individuals with severe global aphasia seem to be fine on those tests. So it doesn't seem like, again, it's a critical precursor for being able to engage in navigation, but there may be more things to do. Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Tally, you're next.
Oh, hi, Tally.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the really interesting talk. I was curious, you mentioned that selectivity is not necessarily innateness. So I was wondering, although this is a bit philosophy, which you mentioned.
It's fine. It's fine.
But still, if you have any thoughts on how they can coexist, specificity without innateness, because if something is not innate, then it's built on other cognitive processes that share the same basic components, and then there wouldn't be any specificity. So how do you?
But that's not right. I mean, so like in the visual cortex, the visual word form area, right? If you are not literate, if you don't learn to read, you don't have that region. And then of course it builds on the kind of machinery there is in the visual cortex. And it turns out that the particular patterns of connectivity of that part of the visual cortex is what determines where that region emerges. And then it emerges, and through experience, it becomes highly attuned to letter strings, but doesn't respond to any other things. So there's certainly these emergent selectivities as a function of like the increased need to suddenly deal with particular kinds of stimuli. For language, like I said, my hunch is that it probably built on basic social circuits. That's, you know, at this point is just trying to like piece a bunch of strands of evidence together. It seems like a plausible idea worth investigating to me, but I don't think anybody has direct evidence or data on how the language regions emerge developmentally, because we haven't been able to look at brains of kids at the time when that happens. People have been historically looking at infants, including neonates, right? You can just put them on the scanner, they just sleep there. And a lot of auditory information goes through, so you can do that. And then you scan kids from about age 4 or 5 onwards. And by that time, language is there. And at that time, it kind of looks like a normal adult system, except a little more bilateral, according to some stories. What happens between half a year and like 2 is, you know, the gold spot. And like I said, I hope that methods like Rebecca Sachs has been developing of putting it awake 1-year-old, 2-year-olds in the scanner and getting them to do tasks, that will be, you know, hugely transformative to, you know, learning something about what these regions look like when you don't quite have language yet, but are maybe starting to get the idea that you can use these consistent strings of sounds to refer to the same kind of objects in the world or something. But yeah, for now, I just think we just don't know. And my bias is to think that you can learn all that. We're very sophisticated learners. A lot of the generative claims against learning have been assuming really dumb learning mechanisms. And if you say, yeah, if you have a dumb learning mechanisms like put this word in a second linear position in a sentence, yeah, you're not going to learn it. But we're very good Bayesian learners, and we can make sense of a lot of complex patterns in the world. And so again, it seems like there's now growing evidence, including a beautiful paper by Steve Piantadosi that just came out, I think last week or 2 weeks ago in PNAS, suggesting that even pretty sophisticated bits of grammar are learnable from the input.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gabriella?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to listen to this talk, and I always spot something new that I didn't quite get the previous time. There's something you said that kind of made me go, what? You talked about not having selectivity for syntax, but to have selectivities inside for words. And there, of course, and in part you have answered this question just a few minutes ago, talking about the distinction between real world knowledge and lexical semantic knowledge, right? So the question is really indeed, is this selectivity related to concepts, related to words? Where is the line between lexical semantics and conceptual semantics?
I really honestly, like the main reason I mentioned this is because I was suspecting that somebody at Moss would be like, no, there are patients with selective like word access problems. And that's certainly true. So that's the kind of evidence that people say, okay, look, there's something where like syntax is fine. Some of the words are fine, but like some words, and in some cases, particular classes of words, they just can't retrieve them. The cases I'm referring to are not cases like semantic dementia where the knowledge dissolves, allegedly, right? Where people just lose all the details of like what a giraffe is like, and it's reduced to this like, you know, vague animal creature or something like that. I'm talking specifically about lexical access problems. And some of those have been reported in cases of anterior temporal damage. And so there's this debate between some people who say that there's lexical access happening in some parts of the anterior temporal cortex, and others who say it's semantic knowledge. Maybe it's both, maybe they're nearby, but it's still kind of, yeah, I think people haven't reached a happy consensus there. But the stuff I'm talking about is not the knowledge stuff.
Right.
It's
Okay.
just
Okay.
defined word retrieval. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you all.
I think we've come to a very last question. Josh, would you like to ask your second question?
Oh yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, hang on, let me get my video back up. Never mind. Yeah, so you mentioned in your answer to my first question about if we look at like an infant's brain as it's developing, we can see, you said there might be differentiation and maybe this is one region at first and then it sort of differentiates. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot in my thoughts on language evolution from the perspective of theoretical linguistics, that there should be certain parallels that we expect to see, and I've been getting a lot of pushback on that a little bit, honestly, to my surprise. It feels to me like that developmental system is kind of where we should be looking. So yeah, I'm wondering if you can elaborate on like what your intuitions are and what data you bring to it about what kinds of parallels we should expect to see and where we might be able to take notes of a property or an empirical fact of acquisition and maybe infer something about the evolutionary past.
Yeah, it's a really hard question. I mean, honestly, like I kind of take it as a truism that a lot of aspects of evolution seem to be recapitulated to some extent in development. I can't even tell you like originally what the like first source for that claim is. If anybody knows, please chime in, but I'm trying to think of like who originally made that claim. But I don't have any data from kids that could speak to evolution, but it seems like the best shot we have to look at this. I mean, if they object to like what, you know, they just want to sit around and think, like this is at least some kind of data that could potentially speak to it, right? Like it's better than nothing.
Right. I mean, like it's not going to be.
I say push back.
Yeah, it's like it's not going to be qualitatively similar, right? Kids don't go through an Indo-European stage;
That's
they go
right,
through a
that's
one-word
right.
and two-word stage. But
That's
but
right.
yeah, there should be
So
sort
it's
of
more like
dependence.
that's right. But I mean, certainly it's the case that like a lot of abilities that emerge in infants, like understanding, you know, shared attention, right? Understanding that some other person and you may be looking at the same thing, and then it's more likely that somebody's going to refer to something that you're sharing in your visual or whatever other perceptual experiences. Some of these capacities are present in non-human primates, and certain vocalizations are shared, but of course between humans and non-human primates. And then it seems like where it's, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I'll say one other controversial thing, where people have long just, well, this is from the generative tradition, people just say how words are not important. And well, my dog can learn 200 words, right? Like there's all these stories, like, so it can be qualitatively different with respect to words. But these animals, dogs, monkeys, they can't learn 10,000 words. And having a large capacity to store information, I think, is way, way underappreciated. There's this historical, I think, very human-centric view where you want some qualitative change that happen in your brain, some new brain region emerge, some new circuit type that will suddenly make us human. Whereas the most plausible null is that the brain scaled up, there's more information that can be stored. More information stored allows for more abstraction, allows for more generalization. And maybe just having enough communicative signals stored then can give rise to combinatorics. Steve Piantadosi and I have a paper where kind of like back of an envelope calculations where we try to make that claim. This is just kind of based on pure math proofs that you can have that happen. It's not evidence or anything, but I often say now when I teach classes, and this is like, I think it's orders of magnitude more communicative signals stored is a big deal. It's not just like, oh, any animal can learn words. It's different amounts, and that may really matter.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this fabulously interesting evening. What a way to end the first half of the week.
My pleasure. That was really fun.
Thanks,
guys. And thanks for all your
Thanks,
questions.
everybody,
It was really fun. Stay safe,
Thanks so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.